things start to radically change around 1980, give or take a few years, where you have, I always say, like, nobody had retirement accounts in 1970 because they didn't exist. They weren't on the scene yet. And so then retirement, in my mind, became like an industry.
Yeah.
And so when all that happens, you have all of the people that essentially call them baby boomers or those generations that grew up out of the 1950s. When they start working, they're able to buy homes and basically take over the equities market and then ride that to the top where we are now. And recent studies show that essentially each generation after that has exponentially less ability to earn wealth by comparison, just because prices are high.
Right.
And so even if they do the same exact savings behaviors, their outcomes are going to be exponentially lower, to the point where now it's sort of believed that millennials almost have no ability to save and earn wealth to the same level as previous generations.
Your relationship with money matters. I'm Michelle Perkins, and this is the Money and You podcast, where I will be breaking down your relationship with money, offering tough love money tips, and a money dating plan that will focus on lifting the barriers to success to help pave the way for better money practices and increased wealth. It's time to take control to live a limit-free life. It starts today. Hello, and welcome to the Money and You show. I am so excited about today's show. I can barely talk, actually, so I hope the show goes well because I need to be able to talk. I have a guest on today who I spoke with, and I speak to all the guests before they come on. I sort of vet them. I make sure that, we have something interesting to talk about and that they're real and they know their stuff. And so this guest in particular, we had a great talk, and I'm so excited about what he's going to share today. I really want you to stick around for this. This is going to be great. We're going to talk a lot about retirement, but in a way that you've never heard before. And whether you're young or on the verge of retirement, this show is absolutely for you. It's about, kind of life-changing ideas, actually. So I am going to introduce you, and my guest is here in the studio, which almost never happens, and as you know, I love that. So he's right here, and we're going to have a great conversation, and you're going to find it fascinating. There's a lot of philosophy in today's conversation, which is what makes this whole topic interesting and fun to me, so you're going to see. Okay, Jonathan Grimm is the author of The Future Poor: How Families and Communities Can Join Together to Survive the Looming Retirement Crisis. He's a licensed financial advisor and founder of Tend Financial and co-host of his own podcast, What's Up with Money. He blends his educational background in ethics and philosophy with his over 20 years of business management and operations experience for a new and fresh approach to finance that he believes is for the economic and social well-being of us all, which is very aligned with the work that I do. Jonathan lives in the Los Angeles area with his wife, Amy, an award-winning marriage and family therapist, and their 3 children, Kate, Dawson, and Rome. Cool names. His lifelong interest includes Star Wars, Lego, football, basketball, and Nike shoes. Welcome, Jonathan.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Happy to share, and I'm excited for the conversation. It should be fun.
Yeah, this is going to be a great conversation. And I'm going to dive in. If you go to your website, which give me your website again.
Thefuturepoor.com.
Thefuturepoor.com.
Hopefully it's easy to remember.
Yeah, and it's also on the screen for those watching on YouTube. He has a video on there that I would suggest everybody watch. It is an excellent video, and I'm going to have him summarize a little bit. It provides history of how we developed the system of retirement that we currently have. And then it talks about how society has completely changed, and so much has changed that to look at that way of retiring at this point in time is going to be pretty problematic, I think.
Yes.
So, and then he provides some inspiration on what we can do. So, Jonathan.
Yeah, so the video it's about 11 or 12 minutes. It was done for an iPhone film festival for a friend, and the idea of it was to sort of, how can I take and compress these ideas that I've been working on for probably the last 4 years or so into something more entertaining and palpable, because it's not always easy. It's sometimes depressing to talk about old age poverty And so how could we sort of package it up in a nice, neat thing that sort of could walk people through the arc of how retirement is actually sort of a brand new thing in human history. No real concept of it before around the late 1800s. And so it kind of started in Germany. Few different factors, one being a major labor crisis where old people at the time couldn't leave work because if they did, they had no money.
Right.
And so everyone knows that's a bad situation. And so then how that sort of turned into what we now kind of think of as Social Security, and then how that made its way to the U.S., and then with the Great Depression and World War II, and then a whole new thing sort of emerging after World War II. So from 1950 to 1980, the idea of retiring actually sort of became a thing where you could actually exit the workforce at 65 and be okay. Life expectancy was pretty low still. We also had low expenses. We had income coming in from Social Security, and people had pensions back then. We also had low medical expense back then, which is a huge factor in thinking about aging.
Right.
And then people generally had a pretty simple life.
Yeah.
By comparison to the complexity that we now engage in. You know, electricity was still entering the whole United States, things like refrigerators, things like iPhones, internet, televisions, all this stuff that we now kind of require weren't even in people's minds then. And so then as you go, that whole system of what made it work, in addition to like what I call our social pillars, whether it be education, faith communities, corporate world with, you know, pensions and income. You also had government support being there, and then you also had familial support. So people stayed pretty close to home. We didn't get out and travel as far from our family of origin as we used to. And so then when you have all of those things that sort of make it work, then if you look now and fast forward, you kind of see that none of those are really there anymore for us. And so then how do we then move forward?
Right. And you know what's so interesting is people, well, this is a huge part of the work I do because people, A, stay stuck in their thoughts and beliefs and habit patterns. And so, you know, what was true for you, I hear this all the time, and it kind of drives me nuts because I have a 24 and a 27-year-old. Okay. And how I deal with them at that age from a financial standpoint is very, very different than how my parents dealt with me.
Yeah.
And people will look at that and go, oh, you know, you're giving them too much or whatever. There's a whole lot of thoughts, you know, a lot of opinions I get. But I feel like they're not actually looking at the world today and what it takes to pay for education, to pay for rents, to pay for anything, and how different it is for kids to go off and be independent. I left home at 18. Actually, wasn't hard to do. You could get a job and you could get an apartment, and you know, you couldn't go to Hawaii, but you could do a lot of things. You could live your life. Yeah. And so that's a little bit of a side note, but the point is we get stuck in time. And I think a lot of us still think the world is working the way it did when we launched.
Yeah, and I kind of think that in many cases we're stuck in like 1980. I use 1980 as like a good reference point.
I was thinking 1980 too. I was like going from 50s to 80s. That's where like most of my people's who are my age, kind of their heads are still there. Yeah,
and you see some interesting things not only within history, but then within markets in and of themselves, where things start to radically change around 1980, give or take a few years, where you have, you know, I always say, like, nobody had retirement accounts in 1970 because they didn't exist. They weren't on the scene yet. And so then retirement, in my mind, became like an industry. Yeah. And so when all that happens, you have all of the people that essentially call them baby boomers or those generations that grew up out of the 1950s. When they start working, they're able to buy homes and basically take over the equities market and then ride that to the top where we are now. And recent studies show that essentially each generation after that has exponentially less ability to earn wealth by comparison, just because prices are high. And so even if they do the same exact savings behaviors, their outcomes are going to be exponentially lower, to the point where now it's sort of believed that millennials almost have no ability to save and earn wealth to the same level as previous generations. Yeah, it's a lot to take in, because the rules are set up, you know, under one
particular paradigm, and they don't apply anymore, but we don't have new rules.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's kind of the problem behind why I wrote The Future Poor, was sort of exploring. When I got into the finance industry, I thought I'd be doing wealth management, building portfolios,
right,
figuring out retirement income, and then I quickly realized, as I was working with clients, and just sort of the disconnect between how the financial industry is sort of structured and what we tell people to do, and then really asking a question like, well, does it actually work?
Yeah.
Can this strategy actually provide people a level of retirement income in the future that actually will take care of them? And one of the things I kind of realized was, oh gosh, this is not going to end well. Like, we're going to be at or below a poverty level of income if we keep running this same game into the future.
Right. And it's interesting to think about, because I talk about this sometimes on the show, but I recently was taking care of my parents for a couple of years, very recently, and then they passed, and they were taking care of my sister, who has some disabilities her whole life.
Yeah.
So my dad was really, and my mom, they were very good financially. So they planned, and but they had all these previous generations. They didn't have a pension, but they had a good retirement.
Okay.
My dad was a professor. But yeah, they managed to be able to get the care they needed, which was extremely costly.
Yeah.
And to set something up for my sister. And all of these things took place that allowed me to take care of them, and now to take care of her to a point. I mean, and they weren't like rich people. They were, upper middle class people doing the things that the financial industry advised them to do, and it worked well. And I just looked at that whole picture, and I thought, if I were in their position, 20 years from now, I mean, from a financial standpoint, I don't know how I could be taken care of the way they were, or anything.
Yeah, what I realized is that the game has entirely shifted. So like those things that I mentioned before, like our social pillars don't really take an involvement in our financial lives anymore.
Right.
And then the economic things of like, we're not going to have high income. Social Security it's not income replacement. Medicare doesn't cover everything. Then you look at long life, because one of the wild things is over the last century we've increased life expectancy by 2 decades, which we should celebrate that kind of like achievement. But with that, we've also increased the life expectancy by 2 decades, and so now it's a whole different thing of trying to plan for 5 years, or do you plan for 25 years?
Right.
What do we do?
I love that you brought that up, because just from an ethics standpoint, we have all these medical advancements that allow us to live a longer life, and yet we spend those last couple decades, frankly, spending most of it worrying about money and will it last?
Yeah.
Like, that's not fun.
Because retirees tend to cite, will I run out of money as their number one anxiety, because when you don't have income coming in from like a job and you have to live off your assets, that's limited. And so then accumulating more might be out of the question. So then you have to run this real careful paradigm of working with the market. Is the market up, down? Do I take out 5% of my account? Do I want to take out 10 and maybe run out of money faster? Or am I going to live to 70, or am I going to live to 92? Yeah. It's almost an impossible calculation, because we still can't predict the future. And so then when you put all those things together, you end up with this real moral equation that we have to really come to grips with now, whereas most people, I think, tend to just think of it as a personal economic thing. Well, just save more, or just cut your expenses, all those sorts of things. But there's a whole lot more at play, especially when you think about old age poverty and people being, I always say poverty is always the biggest tax on any society, whether that's for individual level. Poverty doesn't help you in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
For a family or for a local community, it's very bad. And then socially, in like for a larger society, it's never a good thing. And so that got my alarm bells ringing of like, okay, what do we do if we have 20 million poor people over 65? Like, what in the world do we do to solve that? Because that's a huge issue.
It's a huge issue. We know it's coming, because the baby boomers are all, getting older right now. And it's a little fascinating. I guess part of the excitement of having you on was to have somebody who is in the finance industry but is a critical thinker about the whole thing. And this idea that we just go along and sort of don't think about it. It's what I always teach people not to do with their personal finance. Don't avoid looking at your money, and yet we're avoiding these societal issues.
Yeah. One of the things that I started looking at was, okay, if the idea of retirement and exiting the workforce at 65 and living off your assets is kind of gone, well, then let's just remove that from the equation. And so I might be the weirdo in the financial advising space that kind of goes,
smart one.
Well, let's, maybe, thank you, I appreciate the compliment. But I might be the one that just says, well, if that's the problem, why don't we just remove that and try something different? Right. And that's where I started looking at from a different perspective. I mean, you mentioned like old age care. Like most people don't plan for old age care until they're 65, 70, and then in that case, they might not have enough accumulated, or the financial tools that do that the best, they might be restricted from even having access to.
Yeah.
And so that caused me and my financial planning partners to kind of rethink the whole thing and say, what if we, instead of going accumulation and then distribution, what if we start with distribution in mind? And what you actually need money for.
Right.
Will that then tell us how and where we should accumulate money so that when you get to 70 or 80, you've got the right tools in place ahead of time. And we all know in the financial industry, if you start earlier, it's better.
Yeah.
All of us know that. It's no secret. You know, you probably talk to people about that all the time as far as just like get going, because time is a huge variable in this equation.
Right.
And you know, most 30-year-olds don't want to think about long-term care.
I didn't.
Yeah.
I wish I had.
Yeah,
At the time, it seemed like a ridiculous thing to put money into.
Yeah. And there's all and that's where when you work with people that actually specialize and know how these different tools work, then you can get the one that's right, and it actually can be very economical and actually beat other investment tools if done right. And so when we looked at it, it was like, okay, right now it's 70% of people that make it to 65 will need long-term services and support.
Wow. Okay.
And so that's only going to get higher.
Yeah.
And so as a betting person, I'm like, well, if I have a 75% chance of this expense happening and it costs, you know, today it costs $100,000 a year, I better have 5, 6, 7, or $1 million worth of some sort of benefit for that specific job in the future. Otherwise, I have to use another asset, sell a home, liquidate retirement accounts, all those other things.
Yeah.
And so that also then creates the sort of the financial pickle of the future, and then the subsequent need for other generations to sort of either pick up the tab, pick up the care. I mean, you mentioned caring for family and things like that. You know, lots of people end up having to do that because the resources and things like aren't there, and then that just depletes entire systems.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for a year straight about long-term care insurance, about, you know, just the cost of care in general, no matter how you try to put it together. I mean, it was shocking to me.
Yeah. Well, and most people aren't prepared to cut $100,000 a year checks for something.
I don't even want to go there because
want to move to a happier topic?
No, it's not that it's not happy. It's so complex.
Yeah.
And that's what we don't think about. People are like, oh, I want to stay in my home and get a caregiver. Okay. That's a nice, simple sounding thing, but it gets so complicated when you really deal with it.
And then when you look at how there's such a gap, I mean, everyone knows there's a gap in quote unquote retirement savings. Like it's not a secret.
Yeah.
But what I think is puzzling to me is we're still trying to make the old equation work, even though we know people don't have, you know, expendable income. People don't have, you know, $10,000, $20,000 a year just to put away for the future.
Right.
In most cases. And we also know, given the way things are working now with inflation and things like that, you're going to need upwards of 25 to 50 times your income saved in 20, 30 years, which most people are like, there's no way that's going to happen.
Right.
And so then it's like, okay, well, if we know it's not going to work, then how can we, then do we keep doing it?
Yeah.
And so,
which is the brilliant question that, of course, we don't.
Yeah.
I mean, where do we do that in the rest of our life? You know, I mean, you know, if we know we'll get sick if we only eat chocolate, as fun as chocolate is, it's not going to work for us. So.
Yeah, exactly. And so, even though chocolate's pretty good.
Chocolate is good. A little's okay.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I find extremely fascinating is the work aspect of this.
Yeah.
So this whole old paradigm is based on, you work till you're 65. And what isn't said is typically you're at a job you can't stand, so you can't wait to get out of there.
Yeah.
It's like sucking the life out of you, and you're waiting to 65. I do, in your movie, you have a little thing where you put a date on a calendar for when you retire. And I have a friend who did exactly that. Like he literally, when he got 5 years in, he was literally counting the days and ticking them off. And that, that sentiment was pretty out there.
Yeah.
Which is a lot of why I even started my company, Limit Free Life, initially as a career coaching kind of, career transition coaching company. A lot of it was just about the exploration of how did I choose this career, and is it what I want for my future, and, do I love it enough to stay and not be desperate for retirement?
Yeah. And one of the things that I think is interesting to explore is retirement had to be so attractive for people by 1950, given what they had gone through the 50 years ahead of time.
Right.
Factory work, 2 world wars, the Great Depression. So everyone, and then you only lived to 67. So then everyone, it was like no brainer. Take a couple years off. You guys kind of
And just to interrupt for a second, there wasn't great work out there. So,
work,
you were just happy to have a job, because the alternative, you probably had experienced that, and it was horrible. So
Yeah. And so you end up in this time where it's finally we can sort of rest.
Yeah.
And in many ways, that generation did so much to propel us forward and launch us.
Yeah.
And yet the byproduct of inheriting that type of system, now we kind of have this idea that work is bad.
Right.
Or that work's the enemy.
Yeah.
And I want to sort of reframe that, because work is actually a really awesome thing for us as people. We need it.
Yeah.
We need the social interaction, which is what retirees say they miss the most about work. They don't miss purpose or things. It's just being around people.
Yeah.
Purpose is a big thing, but it's really about doing stuff that's meaningful.
Right.
And how when you're with other people working on something together, that's really good for our bodies, our mental health. It's good for other people. And so I kind of want to reclaim that side of things and go, that's actually better than turning it all off.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people I know, I had a grandfather that worked in a factory, 40 years in a factory. And so for him, it was a welcomed relief,
Right.
And, unfortunately he ended up with a brain tumor, and his retirement was only a couple of years.
Wow.
And so, but you either have that side of things, or you have where we're moving forward now, that is not necessarily the work paradigm that people are in. It's much more thought work, less hands-on, especially as you age. And then there's also ways for, I think in a generational sense, of generational gaps being blended back together in ways that we've all become kind of separated in those things, which isn't good for us. We need to learn from older people, and older people gain so much from younger folks as far as just how the world works now and things like that. So there's part of me, it's I want us to reclaim that work's actually a really good thing. Let's not be so quick to scrap it and kind of, but that's where I think in the moral hierarchy of things, of turning things off might be on the lower end of the moral paradigm, whereas continuing to work and be active actually might have a higher moral place and moral order.
Could not agree with you more.
And then there's also the obvious of the cheapest way to get income is to have a job.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
So there's also that factor, which that's also part of the equation. I'm like, well, what if you rethought work and engaged in more meaningful work? That kind of solves a big income problem, which is what we all have when we think of retirement in the current paradigm.
There was a PBS show that I watched a long time ago that I can't remember, but they went around and they talked to cab drivers and all kinds of people who were over a crazy age, definitely over 85. It could have been over 90, I don't know. And they just talked to them, and they were so, for their age, so healthy, so with it, so kind of vibrant and alive.
Yeah.
And they all attributed it to work, to continuing to work. Now, hopefully by that time you're not working for the money.
Yeah.
You're working because it, like you say, it keeps you engaged with people and the community and everything else. But, and the blue zones talk about it. I mean, they don't talk specifically like you should be at work, but there's a lot of what you're talking about that goes on in the, these things that are talking about longevity and the importance of doing all of this. I love what you're saying. And I feel like if you really don't like, there are some situations. You talked about your grandfather. My grandfather was a carpenter. And so obviously you get to an age where you can't be on roofs and, building things. But certainly there are still things that you can do. And, even related. If you loved what you were doing, you can find something related. If you hated what you were doing, you can find something new. And if money isn't your driving force, you're not trying to build a career and get promoted and, move up, whatever. That's a whole different mindset around work too.
Yeah. And I like one of my favorite movies in regards to this is with Robert De Niro with The Intern.
The Intern. Love that movie. Yeah.
But it's such an interesting thing to watch it from a different perspective of thinking about the moral and ethics of being older and being in a community and seeing what can happen and being open to that I think is really, really interesting. Yeah. And part of my hope in writing the book was to sort of bring that back to life and essentially hopefully move us back from we've become so individualized in some of this stuff that we've lost what matters in some of these cases.
Right.
And then we've lost that side of what work, of the social interactions. Most people say that, at work, that's where they find friends. That's where they find deep social connections and things like that. And so if we can remember that, then I think we start to think differently and can then engage not only financial things, but then just the way we approach and think about where we're heading and where we're going. That can really change a lot of what's at the heart of this problem.
Yeah. I think it's just fascinating. And the intergenerational aspect of this, I think, is really important too, because especially today, I think it was always important, but now, and I don't know, I feel like every generation thinks that theirs is so special and different, but I feel like we have a lot of kind of the old wisdom that's kind of getting lost, and the younger people have all the technological, know-how and everything else. And so you start combining these things, and I think it's, you can do some amazing things.
Yeah, and it's really powerful when you combine all kinds of different resources together. You see it. You've probably seen it with organizations and things that you've been a part of and worked with and helped, and you've seen it with families and people when you start to combine these different skills and build an organization, whether it's small or big, and it's resources in terms of money, talents, abilities, thoughts, ideas. You put all that together, technology, you actually can get something that's way better than anything we can do on our own.
Yeah.
And so, and you see that the things that succeed the most are the ones where there's lots of different hands and lots of different ideas, people bringing to the table their contribution. Sometimes it's just money, and sometimes it's ideas, or, someone that's able to organize people, and you put all that together, and you get something magical.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I love this. So, there's a lot to look at.
We could talk about this for hours.
I know. And it's such a, it's always a beautiful idea when you have a new vision for something. And, it's hard to have a new vision for an entire society. And, I mean, all the biases, the ageism comes into play with respect to work. And there's just so many interesting aspects to this. But on maybe a more micro level to try to help people, think differently, look at things differently. How do you talk about this with your clients, for example?
Yeah, so with my clients, I really focus them on essentially what we call the distribution phase. And I don't mean that just to be like from age 65 on, which is how most of the industry thinks of distribution. Because we kind of need money all of our life.
Right.
And so we're always needing access to money for, vacations or an emergency or, oh, my kid broke his arm. Right. All those things sort of pop up. Life's not linear at all. And so part of what we want to do is go, hey, life's got a ton of risks. As you go deeper into like real deep financial advising, they'll tell you like, oh, there's 40 risk factors you got to solve for. And you're like, oh my gosh, there's no way. But then you're like, okay, most of the industry focuses on 3. And they leave out so many.
What are those 3?
Oh, the 3 usually are investment risk, longevity risk and inflation risk, those kind of, because it's still built on trying to get you to 65 and then turn that into income. And so then those those rise to the top, as opposed to, well, does your 401k do a good job of paying medical expenses? Maybe not. Yeah. And so that's where trying to educate and go, we kind of begin with, hey, we all know it. We all feel it. We all experience it. So let's actually plan in a way that embraces it and it acknowledges it. And then with that, it's explaining, hey, these things are going to happen in life.
Right.
And we want you to be prepared. And so you're going to need money at some point. You also need your money growing. It can't just sit.
Right.
You know, you need to not be in loads and loads of debt. You know, you know, a lot of people right now are rethinking home purchasing. Some people feel like it's out of the question. So then it's like, okay, well, what do we do as an alternative? And not being closed to just being like, no, you got to do it. Like, if you don't, you're a failure in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what we try and do is just reduce financial anxiety through actually having plans that are simple and they just make sense. And so a lot of the stuff just is either too complicated or it doesn't make sense for people. Or they look at it and go, so if I don't spend $20 a month on Starbucks, that'll somehow turn into millions of dollars in the future. And they scratch their head and they run the math and they're like, what am I going to do with $9,000 in 7 years? Yeah. And then they're like, I'd rather have my Starbucks.
Right.
And so, you know, there's a blending there of how we can do both, but also the acknowledgement that, like, I'm not going to save $1 million by not having Starbucks. That's not the barrier.
Right.
And I think with social media and stuff like that, people are a little bit more wise to some of that stuff and calling it out, which is great. But then you get the other side of social media, which is you get some really wild stuff of, like, the best thing to do is buy 10 homes before you're 20. And it's like, who could do that?
Let's talk about social media and the financial advice that's being given. Because I know my kids are watching it and they're taking away a lot. I wish I could go in and, like, pick and choose what they listen to, but I can't.
Yeah, it's a real interesting thing. In one way, it has opened up a lot of education onto things that may have been under the radar, or certain gurus just say are bad, and so then you have other people saying, well, let's rethink this. The other side of it is you get a lot of nonsense out there. And I piggybacked off of an article that was like 5 red flags for, like, looking at the financial advice you're getting. And it's really interesting because, like, most people don't know that a lot of the advisors that they think are professionals or have been in the industry for a long time have no credentials. And that's usually surprising for people. And so I always say, like, if you see someone on TikTok, go to a thing called Broker Check and see if they actually have any licenses to do it. And you'll find, like, most of the best sellers, some of them have some industry experience and things like that, but most don't.
Are they just talking from their own experience? They had something went well and they're like, now I'm an expert?
Their own experience or their own paradigm that they've built. And sometimes people confuse the fact that they've built a successful business with its actual sound financial advice. And so sometimes those go hand in hand, sometimes they don't. And so that's important for people to be aware of. And then really asking, I always tell people, like, let's just ask questions like, does it work? Will doing this strategy actually produce the results? And for when you go to use your money, did it accumulate in the way that then will work? People don't know that they have tax consequences. People don't know that Social Security is subject to income tax. All these different things that then people are like, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. Like, it doesn't work as well as I thought. And so, that's where when you work with someone that's actually strategic, it actually is thinking in terms of sort of a new paradigm and being honest with, like, it's really hard for me sometimes to sit with people and be like, retirement's probably not in the cards the way you think. Like, it saddens me because, like, people built that up. And, but then I also don't, I've told this to the other advisors that work with me. It's like, I don't want to sit across the table from a client in 15 to 20 years and say, hey, you know that plan that I did for you? It didn't actually work. And they sit there and go, but you were the one that told me what to do. And so that's a commitment that I've personally made, and the people that work with me, they sort of follow the same. And so whereas I think a lot of advisors are going to have that conversation in the next decade or two with clients when it comes to, especially when it comes to, like, retirement in the traditional sense of 65.
Yeah, yeah. And, you wonder if any financial advisors are actually having the conversation about, okay, so you're 55, you want to retire from this profession you're in at 65 or this job, but, maybe you should be thinking in the next 10 years of what else you could do to earn some money. I doubt that's ever a conversation. But.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I do a lot of research, and so
Okay.
that's one of the. I always have facts and figures and studies and things like
good.
that. So it's one of my weird quirks. But we always tell people like, hey, $1 million portfolio, like that's like a target that has been put in front of people, and so you just do a little bit of research and you find that there's less than 1 million people that are essentially 401k or IRA millionaires in this country.
Less than how many?
Less than 1 million. And so that's a third
Wow.
of it's a third of a percent of adults.
That's frightening.
And
Yeah.
so then you go, okay, then what's the likelihood of then the other people getting to 1 million? And then you look at, the median is 30,000. So there's a huge gap between 30,000 and a million, and it takes a lot of energy and effort and the absolute best market conditions you could ever imagine to bridge that gap,
Right.
which is it then goes back to why I felt important to sort of rethink the paradigm and write the book and do all of that stuff.
Well, and what you're talking about too, when you think about it, we're not robots yet, and
Yeah.
yeah, because money is so emotional anyway. That's a lot of my whole process is trying to understand your relationship with money. It's a very emotional thing.
Yeah.
So when you talk about what you're talking about, all I can think about is people are going to listen and just think, forget the whole thing. I'm just going to go buy some more ice cream. I mean, it's like, how do you, if you're the guy with the $30,000 and and you're 35, 40 years old, and you don't see a lot of change on the horizon. I mean, this is not, just from an emotional standpoint, your decisions are going to be different.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are ways that those decisions can work against you or work for you.
Right.
And I think my goal is to figure out how do we sort of expose this and then not go the route of just being absolutely depressed by it.
Right.
But then, I in my book, there's a section where I've had multiple friends just be like, well, tell me there's hope. Like, just stop depressing me. Like, ugh.
Here's a future poor book. Read it.
It's like, and I'm like, no, it really is a hopeful message that like we can choose to do things different.
Yeah.
As individuals, with the way we plan and think, within our families, within our communities, within our faith communities. Like, I think faith communities will play a really important role in the future. They kind of have the moral sense of poverty is something that we should fix. Most faith communities have that as some sort of ethic or ethos that's foundational. And how can the government sort of then rethink its position and policies? Education's a huge one. Like, how do we stop giving 18-year-olds $200,000 loans? And perpetuating sort of that problem as well. So there's a bunch of different things that kind of can just be reshaped if we adopt new things. And then just being depressed and going, well, screw it, I'm just going to do whatever I want. That's not a solution either.
No, it's not. Yeah.
And so, but then and I find this is where in the conversation, then people go, what do we do? And it's like, okay, well, there's a few things. One, we need to have high civic involvement again, where that's been on the decline for years.
Yeah.
And that will open us up to a paradigm of, I call it pooled resources, but I also let people know, like, there's two groups of people in this country that do pooled resources very well. The poor do it out of necessity because they just have limited things. And you see that within communities. There's some books about different economies, like out of Detroit and things like that are really fascinating to read. But then you also see it on the wealthy side, too. The wealthy are really good at using pooled resources. The middle class does not. And so
it's a fascinating
idea. So the middle class does not do finance together in any way, shape, or form. It's mine. I earned it. I spend it. Don't talk to me about my money. You probably experience this as you talk to people as well. Like, there's this real guard about, part of it is most of us carry around a lot of shame and anxiety around it. And
100%.
it's like, let's get out of that. Like, because that's not going to help us. We need to move forward with some of these things and change some of the ways we do things and look at things a little different, and then come along with some really viable solutions,
Right.
not only from like the social and ethical side, but also that's where I think my book sort of has an interesting blend, because I take that as well as I am licensed in this stuff,
Yeah, yeah.
and I spend a lot of time and understand how these different things work. And so when you combine those two, I think you get a very different paradigm, and hopefully a very different book than any that's out there at the moment.
Yeah, I am sure it is, and I can't wait to read this book. I'm going to share it with
It's
people.
coming soon.
Oh, so it's not out yet.
It's
They
not.
can't-
It's not out yet. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So you'll
Beginning of the
let
year.
us know when it is.
Yeah,
Because,
beginning of the year.
Yeah, I hope you'll do some pre-sale
Oh,
kind of
yes,
stuff. Yeah,
that is coming.
You know, that was such an interesting point about the middle class being different in that way, and I can see that. And it makes me think differently, because there is a lot of shame, and I always
yeah.
sort of think that most people, you know, regardless of their situation, feel that, and a lot of sort of a scarcity mindset, which is like, you know, when people hunker down and think there won't be more, so they,
Yeah,
you know, keep
yeah.
and don't talk about it. And but I find that the pooled resources idea is really interesting on both ends of the spectrum, because that is kind of a wonderful thing, and people are talking about money. I mean, they're
Yeah.
talking about what they don't have on one end and what
Yeah.
they do have on the
Yeah.
other, which, you know, probably better to be talking about what you're hoping to have and what you're planning to have. But that's a really interesting concept. And, you know, everything you're talking about, I love that you have brought up the idea of, you know, we need to elevate the poor, which has always been an interest of mine. And because it doesn't, you know, I think there is a lot of thinking out there that as long as I get rich and I can provide for my family, then, you know, doesn't
Yeah.
really matter what's going on, or it matters, but it doesn't affect me.
Yeah.
And it does affect you, and it always
does.
has
Yeah.
affected you and me and everybody. I
Yeah.
mean, you know.
Yeah, it you know, we can think we're insulated, but I mean, we're in the Los Angeles area where homelessness and foster care is, you know, the largest, you know, pretty much in the country. And so you have these two. My friend that works in the foster care system just says they're just the future homeless.
Yeah.
And so you have those things, but they create enormous taxes on
Right.
society.
Right.
And it's not a shame thing or a thing against them, but it's why societies for all of time have worked hard to
Right.
try and not have that be there. And because we don't want people to live in a dehumanized
Right.
space. And I think we all get that sense, and we wouldn't want that for ourselves. But so many of the systems that we've got in place are moving people closer and closer to that,
yeah.
which is a real scary thing.
It's
from
very
my
scary,
perspective.
and it's dehumanizing for everybody. It's for them. They're living a dehumanized life, if that's a word.
Yeah.
But for us, it's dehumanizing too. Just driving by them and just on our way to buy more Starbucks, you know, when they're
Yeah.
on the street. So it's just not a. I mean, there's no argument you could make that is going to make for a better society.
Yeah. Well, and there's this interesting old article where a guy talks about when we put people in a place where they can't be charitable, they lose
Yeah.
their spirit.
Yeah.
And, you know, that traces back to different religious traditions as well that talk about charity and spirit and human beings being linked. And so when you're not able to be charitable, we lose something in ourselves. And
Right.
that's really sad to me. And
Yeah.
I think that's all part of this equation of really taking this different perspective on things like retirement or
Right.
financial advising or planning.
Which kind of wraps up into sort of like, what is wealth? I mean, you know, are you wealthy if you just have like so much money that you're going to be able to sit on your couch after retirement and not think about it? Or are you wealthy because you are engaged with people, you are helping people, you are, you know, learning and growing yourself still? I mean, I see a lot of, I like to look at old ladies on TikTok like Jane Fonda and people like that and talking about just what it is like to be older in today's world. And, you know, they all talk about you still need to make friends, you still need to be learning and doing things and engaged. Like that's how they're active in their 90s or whatever.
Yeah.
And where was I going with this? I lost my train of thought. I just think all of this is so fascinating that I literally forgot my point on that one. I'm sorry.
Well, that's my goal.
Sorry.
That's my goal is to,
Yeah.
is to be so engaging and entertaining that you lose your thought. So.
But we do wealth. Okay,
Wealth.
What is wealth? I mean, you really have to ask yourself that, I think, before you sit down, because for some people, wealth is not about having the most money. It's about, being able to enjoy your grandkids and be healthy and travel or whatever it is. I love the idea that just like your career should be kind of something you create, so should the concept of wealth. It's up to you what's wealthy.
Yeah, and in doing this, one of the big sort of pivots that I made was thinking in terms of health as opposed to wealth, and studying public health research and essentially studying something known as the social determinants of health, where they basically have globally studied that where 5 things exist, people are healthy, and it's a real simple equation, and we've pretty much missed it in a lot of ways here. But it's economic stability, access and quality healthcare, access and quality education, built environment. Those are things like roads, grocery stores, those sorts of things that sort of create mobility and things and structure, and then it's social and community context. And so in most cases we're not doing any of those very well anymore, and then where those exist we find extreme health in people, and like the US just fell out of the top 20 on the global retirement index this year.
Oh, I didn't know there was a global retirement index.
Nobody does. Again, all this weird stuff I look at, but we're now number 22, and so then when you compare, like when we keep falling, and I think it's because those 5 factors are moving further and further away from people, and essentially just creating a less healthy America, or a less, now I sound like a politician, but a less healthy environment for us to really succeed. And so how do we get back to that? Because I think we've had it in the past.
I think we had it too. So that index, that's saying that we're falling in terms of how great situation you're going to have in retirement, or what exactly are we
it's essentially
assessing?
there's a bunch of different factors, but it's essentially looking at the possibility of someone having, it's essentially looking at old age and going,
quality of life.
These countries do a better job of providing quality of life, stability, resources for people as they age, especially when people get into situations where they can't take care of themselves, either through mental illness, physical disability, or their frailty. All those different things start to come into play. Right. So we are dropping.
Yeah. And of course that affects the rest of the people. So don't think it's just the old person and oh well, sorry for them, because as children or grandchildren, I mean, you're probably going to be helping them out, or you're going to be at least, feeling anxiety.
Yeah.
If you can't help them out. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, it affects everybody. There's a whole ripple effect through families and through society so this is super important.
Thank you.
Work that you're doing.
Thank you. It's growing. So you're part of it, and thank you for bringing it to light from
oh my gosh.
your platform.
I think it's so important. I do think we're a little bit at a choice point here about, like, we keep going into I don't know what, or we change things.
Well, in bringing it back to my video where we began, I do end by being at a large fork in the road that's situated in Pasadena,
Was that
California.
a real fork?
It is, yeah. So there's this huge, like 20-something foot wooden fork that's literally at a fork in the road in Pasadena.
I love that.
So you can go drive by it.
Yeah,
so.
I will.
But,
okay, and so just quickly, because I could talk to you forever. I'd love for you to actually come back on when it gets closer to your book launch and keep talking about this. Hopefully there'll be, between now and then, there'll be a few changes we can talk about as you do your research. So tell people how they can get a hold of you.
Yeah, so best things to do is go to thefuturepoor.com. That's where everything sort of lives, whether it's regarding my financial practice or regarding podcasts or things like that. So futurepoor.com, right there on the front page is signing up for what I call the Grim News. I know. I gotta use my last name. So,
I know, it's just so perfect.
So what I do is with the Grim News, part of it is updates regarding the book, but it's mainly because I read and write so much regarding just the financial landscape that we're all living in. pulling different articles. Some of them are really fun. They're not all like the world's going, is doomed, but they're really fun. Like one recent one was like looking at the economic impact of Caitlin Clark in the WNBA, and just sort of seeing like, look at this thing. Like it has to do with like our financial landscape, the economy, and things like that. There's these different things that happen that are pretty unique.
Yeah,
it's also looking at reality and depressing stuff too. But I try and bring insight about different things, and changes are always happening. Tax laws are changing.
Right.
Rules about accounts change, and so some of it is just a place for people to kind of come and get some daily stuff. So my son that's in the video,
the mathlete?
My mathlete, he's an award-winning mathlete, which that is a fact. But we do Rome Teaches Money videos every Friday.
Oh, fun.
Like 1 minute, to minute and 15 seconds, just little snippets about things, just to kind of get some fun education. People tend to like him more than me anyway.
I know you're good together. Your videos are very funny.
So we try and, because finance is so stuffy and boring oftentimes, so we try and have fun with it. And and he's great. So, but all of that kind of comes in there, and then you can, there's also links to the podcast. It's on Apple and things like that. It's What's Up with Money.
Yeah.
I host it with Ryan Roop, who is a writer and a millennial, and not involved in the financial world at all, which is good. So you don't get two of me having a conversation. And then our financial practice, because one of the things that I know is really important is a lot of this can be theory, and a lot of this can be, what do I do? And it's one thing for people to go online and say, open a Roth IRA. It's a whole nother thing to sit with someone and then know how you're going to use that tool in conjunction with your other tools,
right?
How you're going to fund those, put those together to create a financial life.
Right.
And that's one of the things that is often overlooked in working with someone that can plan the way that we do.
Right.
And so, if people have questions, we are very open. I'm a big believer. Sometimes my guys get mad at me because I'm like, I'll help anybody. But there really is that ethical side of me that wants this to be part of fixing some of the stuff, fixing some of the ways we plan.
Right.
And so we have some things in there and some processes and can walk through things with people, whether they work with us or not.
Right.
We want people to have a better situation than the one we've currently put people on.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, Jonathan, we are. I never even go this long, but we're here at the top of the hour. So
this is so fun.
It's so fun, and
even with a depressing topic.
And you know what? It's not a depressing topic. You're right, people. Not a depressing topic. This is about awareness and finding hope and going forward in some new ways. And that's how we change everything in our life. Whatever it is, we have to get self-aware. That's the whole thing with knowing your relationship with money. Understand yourself, understand your situation, understand the world, and then go forward with a new path. And So and you can help people develop that new path. Yeah. So I think the name of your book is great because it snaps you out of your stupor and makes you realize you need to take some action. Yep. And the historical information, all that stuff, it's fascinating to me how little we teach about how we ever got to the way we do money. Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. Yeah. We need money, we want money, but we don't spend any time learning about it. So it's a little interesting. Anyway, I hate to end this, but I must, and I am going to be inviting you back. I hope you will come. I just said it in front of everybody, so if you never show up again, they're going to know that you. I know.
I'm committed.
No
I will be back whenever you want to have me.
And listeners, thank you so much for being here. I love today's show, and I really hope you'll listen to it, take it in, check out Jonathan Grimm's website and thefuturepoor.com, and get his book when it goes on pre-sale, and just think about this stuff. This is fascinating stuff. This is meant to get you also thinking critically about all things finance and your life and what you need and want. So thanks so much for being here. If you like the show, please share it, and we'll see you next week.